In today's lecture, we're going to talk about the allegory in Art Spiegelman's Mouse. And I just want to start by asking this question, what is an allegory? So this is an important literary device that you should know and become more familiar with as we're studying our literature over the course of this semester. So an allegory is a literary device used to convey symbolic or hidden meaning through characters or events. I like to sort of compare it to a layered narrative. So you have a literal meaning of the story, and then you have underlying symbolic meanings of the story. So it's really a layered narrative where there is sort of deeper levels of meaning that you can sort of infer and read into. So you're probably already familiar with some examples of allegory. You might just not recognize it yet. Most of you, or some of you maybe, have read George Orwell's Animal Farm in high school. So this would be an allegorical tale that uses animals as well. So they don't all have to use animals, but this is just an example, like Mouse, where animals are used to convey meaning or have more symbolic meanings attached to them. So in Animal Farm, if you know anything about that story, it was about farm animals. So on the literal level, it was about farm animals taking over their farmer's land and kicking out their human owner and rebelling against the human owner of the farm. And it featured talking animals. And if you know anything about the allegorical level of the story, you probably talked about how each of the animal characters represented a historical figure of the Russian Revolution. So you have characters like Lenin and Trotsky and all those characters being sort of represented through animal characters in Orwell's story. So in that case, we have a historical allegory being sort of represented through a literal story about animals overthrowing the farm. Other examples that you might be familiar with would be C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So in that story, we have, again, children going through the wardrobe, and then this magical fantasy world opens up to them as they go through this wardrobe. And they meet Aslan the lion, who is sort of this mystical leader of the creatures, the magical creatures. So Aslan is the king of like Narnia, this mythical land. So on that level, it's just a fantasy story, but when you dig deeper and you look at how some of the characters maybe stand for ideas, or we can sort of read into and look for other sort of familiar narratives that exist. We can read Aslan's journey. He dies and then is reborn, and he sacrifices himself to save others. So in that case, we have an example of a religious allegory where Aslan would be like a Jesus figure, a savior, who again sacrifices himself for others. So in that case, we have a religious allegory being played out through children's narrative. And then the last example I can think of for allegory would be just popular science fiction films. So I'm sure you've seen Avatar, maybe you've seen District 9. Both of these are examples of using allegory in science fiction. So on the surface, these are both films about aliens. In one, in District 9, the aliens come and land in South Africa and occupy that territory, and they're treated as second-class citizens and separated off, segregated, and treated poorly. So again, it becomes a commentary or allegory for the political and historical situation in South Africa. And it's used, so the author of the story is trying to sort of convey messages about this real political historical situation through the allegory of aliens. And in Avatar, we have the same sort of situation, but these are this alien planet which is being colonized and invaded, and again, invaded for the use of their resources. So we have an example of a sort of historical allegory where the history of colonization of sort of like North America would be being discussed indirectly through James Cameron's film Avatar, right? So his description of the alien planet being invaded and that whole sort of culture that he creates of the alien species in Avatar. So again, it's a layered narrative where on the surface level we might have just a plain literal meaning of the story, animal characters or alien characters, whatever it is, and then below the surface it's a commentary or a symbolic meaning attached to the characters where we can find and draw connections between history or other texts, so the Bible, religious narratives. And in this case, in Mouse, we will have a historical narrative being played out, right? So this is animal characters, mice and cats being representing the German and Jewish conflict in World War II. So we might want to consider how Art Spiegelman uses the allegory as a sort of commentary on racism and in particular anti-Semitism as it existed in World War II. And we might think about your own perception or definition of racism. And I have a definition here. So it is the belief that all members of each race possess characteristics, abilities, or qualities specific to that race, especially so as to distinguish them as inferior or superior to other race or races. So it again goes into this idea of stereotypes, as well as there's this power inequality or power disparity that exists. So it's based on a system of beliefs. They're not based in reality, right? There's no biological proof that one race is inferior or superior to another. It's just based on ideas that a group of people have, and then their ability to enforce this set of ideas. It's what we would call an ideology. So at the time, during World War II, we have this Nazi party led by Hitler, and then his belief that the Aryan race was, again, superior to all other races, ethnicities, and groups of people. And racism includes prejudice, discrimination, and any sort of antagonism based on this belief that one's own race is superior. And I'm asking the question whether or not you've experienced or witnessed racism, and what other isms have you heard. You might come up with some answers in your head, so just brainstorm on your own. You know, sexism is another one, ableism, so the belief that being able-bodied is better than being or having challenges, physical challenges. Other isms. Sexism would be, again, the perception or belief that one sex is superior to the other. In our society, we usually have the standard patriarchal assumption that the male sex is superior in some ways than the female sex. So we know we are challenging these ideas, and again, I think Art Spiegelman is challenging racism in this case through his allegorical representation of this time period. You could also consider ageism as another one, so the perception that people of a certain age are not as valuable or as they don't have the same sort of rights as other people of other ages. So if you think about, you know, maybe there's prejudice or discrimination against someone who is too old or too young for a job, so that's another kind of ism that we could talk about. So there's lots of sort of parallels you can think about, but at this time we're going to talk about anti-Semitism, which is the prejudice, discrimination, hatred of somebody or a group of people based on their belief in Judaism. and association with being Jewish community. So we've already sort of talked about the allegory as it exists, but I just want to sort of break it down even further. So when we think about the allegory in Maus, we have Spiegelman using animals to represent what were perceived at the time as different races, but really he's just talking about different sort of nationalities. He draws the Germans as cats. He draws Jewish characters as mice. The Americans are drawn as dogs. The French are drawn as frogs. Gypsies are moths, and Polish people are drawn as pigs. So at the start of book one, we have all these sort of separate categories established, and you have to sort of remember this is like 1939, and ethnic groups were again considered very separate. You belong to your group, and there was no sort of blurring of lines, or that was the perception. Nowadays, we don't consider ethnicity to be as static, or your identity is not as sort of not as divisive as we see or as it existed at the time. So, if we were using Art Spiegelman's allegory that he invented for Maus, we could think about our own Canadian identity. There are no Canadians in the book, right? So we can sort of project our assumptions or what the stereotypical Canadian might be represented through, and the only one I could come up with would be the beaver. So I think that sort of again extends Art Spiegelman's allegory, animal allegory, to our identity as Canadians. And he is doing something with the choice of animals as well. Polish people have been sort of have commented on the choice of pigs, but he's definitely sort of using stereotypes that existed at the time and using animals that are sort of particular to that stereotype for that ethnic group. So he acknowledged that pigs, Nazis sometimes refer to Polish people as pigs, that's why he chose the pig, and they're also sort of separate from the cat and mouse main food chain that's being represented there. And then the Americans are represented as dogs, so we have dog, cat, mouse. And if you know anything about the historical context of World War II, the Americans, their involvement as allies of Britain were really again they were sort of, their force stopped the war, right? Their influence and their military presence sort of marked the end of World War II. So in that regard, we have the dogs coming in and curbing this predatory nature of the cats and their project of destroying the mice. So it's very particular in how Art Spiegelman is sort of choosing the animals to represent these nationalities or ethnicities in the story. And he has acknowledged the fact that the Jewish mouse connection is derived specifically from the ideology that existed at the time from the Nazi Party and Hitler's belief that Jewish people were vermin or pests, and they were treated and viewed as less than human. So if you treat somebody as subhuman, you can think about being subhuman would be being like an animal, right? Being treated like a dog, and you can think about how we treat animals in our society. That's how Jewish people were being treated by the Germans, right? So they were treated like expendable tools, right? We use our farm animals in a very sort of, they're products, right? They're work animals, or they are, again, we use them and discard them, or they're pests, right? So we destroy them. So our perception of mice or rats or how is sort of the equivalent of how the Nazi Party viewed Jewish people at the time. So I want to draw your attention to a link that I've put on the course homepage, which is Art Spiegelman's article, Why Mice? And in this article, he does explain how he sort of came up with the idea